In a world where endless prairies stretch to the horizon and the sky seems like an endless dome over lonely settlements, life here is a constant struggle for survival. The sounds of wild winds and the rustle of dry grass become constant companions of those who dare to call this land their home. Here, among dusty roads and wooden houses, destinies are intertwined in a cruel dance, where every decision can be the last. Today, I'm going to tell you a story that will capture your heart and won't let go until the last word. The story of a girl who was captured by Comanches and the warrior she was supposed to hate, but who changed everything in her life. Before diving into this dramatic and romantic story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Here you will find many of the same fascinating stories that can take you to different corners of the past and present. This story is full not only of fear and pain of captivity, but also of the light of hope, unexpected feelings, and the struggle that flares up not only between nations, but also within each of the characters. Get ready for a journey into the heart of the Wild West, where love and hate go hand in hand, and fate is a cruel but fair judge. Under the scorching sun of the Wild West, where dusty winds carried the smell of burnt grass and hot earth, she lived, a girl with burning eyes in the depths. Her name was Emily, and her appearance was simple, but it had its own special power. Her hair was dark and slightly wavy, fluttering in the wind, and her skin was tanned and covered with a light net of wrinkles from the sun and wind. His gaze was as sharp as a knife, reflecting his inner resilience and thirst for freedom. Emily grew up in a world where every minute could be her last, but she wasn't afraid. Her spirit was rebellious and hot, like a campfire flame at night on the steppe. Her home was a small village on the very edge of civilization, modest, with dusty streets scorched by the sun, with wooden buildings that held up only thanks to the perseverance and patience of its inhabitants. This town seemed like a forgotten time, where everyone knew the other by name, where cowboys gathered on the corners and women hurried about their business, trying to survive in harsh conditions. There were endless prairies and forests nearby, and beyond the horizon began the land of the Comanches, those who were feared and hated here. Emily's family was simple but respectful among the villagers. Her father is a veteran of several skirmishes, courageous and silent, who taught her resilience and self-control. The mother is a kind, hearted woman whose hands have known hard work and who has always tried to inspire her daughter with hope and faith in the best. Although the family was not rich, they lived honestly, valued each other, and dreamed of a world without war and fear. It was this dream that was a secret in Emily's soul. She wanted freedom, but not the kind that comes with guns, but real freedom, without enmity and hatred, where people could live together without constant threat. The girl's inner world was full of contradictions. She was strong and determined, but at the same time gentle and vulnerable. Her dreams went far beyond that small, dusty town. She wanted to see a world where she could just be herself, without looking back at fear and prejudice. This secret hope made her special among others. In Emily's soul lived the hope that one day everything would change, and then she would be able to breathe freely in the open air, without fear of bullets or the words of enemies. In this land, where the earth burned the soles of boots and the sky burned with the hot sun, life was harsh and unyielding. Every day began with hard work, which made my muscles burn and my heart grow stronger. On the border between civilization and the wild, where humanity was fighting the wind, dust, and their own fears, people knew the value of every drop of sweat and every breath of freedom. Emily grew up among those who did not spare themselves for the sake of living in these cruel lands. The neighbors, cowboys, and merchants crossing the dusty streets weren't just neighbors. They were each other's stronghold in this God-forsaken corner. Cowboys with calloused hands and tanned faces, masters of their craft, were always ready to help or get into an argument over a word, but they never left friends in the lurch. Merchants brought a little comfort, sugar, flour, gunpowder, and news from distant territories. It all made up a life filled with quiet struggle and hope. But there was something more in the air, a dark shadow of fear and a premonition of an impending storm. Rumors spread like a hot wind from one end of the village to the other. The Comanches, known for their brutality and strength, were about to cross the border. Their shadows were already looming over the hills, and their screams could sometimes be heard through the night, making one's heart ache with anxiety. No one knew exactly when the next battle would begin, but everyone felt that the calm was only a temporary lull before the storm. Emily, like everyone else around her, learned to live with this fear, hiding it deep inside. Every day she saw neighbors fortifying houses, men gathering to discuss defense, and women sewing bandages and preparing medicines. In this small town on the border, hope and fear were intertwined in an inextricable knot, but it was here, among these simple and resilient people, that a force was born that could withstand even the darkest times. Through the mist of dawn, the first silhouettes appeared on the horizon, Comanche scouts, like shadows gliding over dusty hills. Their appearance was a quiet but disturbing sign that instantly pierced the heart of the village. Every resident felt a chill of fear, as if the earth itself trembled under their feet, warning of an impending storm. The news of the enemy's approach spread through the streets faster than the wind could carry it. People accustomed to living with the threat drew their weapons again, began to strengthen doors and windows, preparing for the inevitable clash. Men gathered into fists, women hurried to collect supplies, and children, not fully understanding the scale of what was happening, hid in the shadows of houses. There was a mixture of tension and hopelessness in the air, but at the same time a quiet hope for protection and salvation. At the center of it all was Emily, whose heart was racing. She felt her world begin to collapse as dreams of peace and freedom slipped through her fingers. Inner doubts and fears burst into her mind. What would happen to her family, to herself? Will they be able to withstand this whirlwind of hatred and violence? She understood that the life she knew would change forever, and there would be no turning back. Every moment before the collision seemed like an eternity filled with expectation and anxiety. At that moment, Emily could not have imagined that it was this catastrophe that would lead her to the man she was supposed to hate and who would change her fate forever. Night fell on the dusty town, as if covering it with its dark veil, but it did not bring peace. Suddenly, the silence was broken by thunderclaps. The sky lit up with flashes of fire and screams piercing the night. The Comanches, like shadows from ancient legends, descended on the settlement with relentless fury, their horsemen racing through the streets, setting fire to houses and wreaking havoc. Residents, caught off guard, rushed in disorderly panic, trying to find shelter or hide what was left of their former lives. The women grabbed their children and raced to the nearest shelters, while the men grabbed their weapons, but many realized that the forces were too unequal. Dust and smoke mixed in the air, turning the night into a vague, terrifying vision. Horses' hooves sounded everywhere, moans and screams that made the skin crawl. Amidst this storm of destruction and fear, Emily was captured and torn away from everything she held dear. She felt her world crumbling as the last threads of security were leaving. Losing control of her own fate was the scariest thing of all. Now she was a prisoner in the hands of those she should have hated all her life. And when her gaze met the eyes of the main Comanche warrior, a man with a cold but penetrating gaze, a shudder ran through her soul. This warrior wasn't just an enemy. He was the personification of fate, which was now deciding for her. His gaze, calm and confident, as if saying without words that her life now belongs to another world, a world of struggle, pain, but also, like no one else knew, love. That night, everything changed forever. The dusty road stretched ahead like an endless stretch of trials along which Emily walked, a prisoner among the same lost souls. The heavy, monotonous step that reverberated in her bones became her new reality. The footsteps and groans, stiff and exhausted, merged into an oppressive symphony, where every moment was filled with the bitterness of loss and despair. The light of the sun, which had previously warmed and promised hope, now burned the skin and harshly reflected impotence. In the crowd, where faces were covered in dust and fatigue, Emily felt like a tiny spark, barely flickering in the ocean of other people's destinies. Every breath was an effort, a reminder of hopelessness, of the loss of everything that had once been dear. My heart was squeezed with horror, fear of the unknown, pain from lost freedom, a painful feeling of loneliness even among people. Her thoughts were racing, trying to stay afloat amid the raging emotions. The memories of home, of family, of dreams seemed distant now, like ghosts that could not be reached. Every minute of the journey was a step towards a new life, but at what cost? Emily understood that control over her fate was slipping away like sand through her fingers. Fear drowned out the voice of reason, leaving only a dark abyss of doubt and pain. In this heavy silence of captivity, she realized for the first time the depth of her vulnerability, how fragile freedom can be, and how easy it is to lose it. But somewhere in the depths of my soul, hidden under a layer of fear and despair, a tiny spark began to break through. Uncertain, weak, but alive, the hope that life, no matter what, could change. And this realization gave her the strength to keep going, even if there was no clear path ahead. In the midst of a dusty and exhausting journey, he appeared, the main warrior of the Comanches. His figure stood out against the grey masses of the prisoners, like a mountain against a plain. Broad shoulders, powerful posture, and a look that hid a whole story, a mystery that could not be solved with just a glance. His eyes, dark and deep, reflected a world full of pain and power at the same time, like a mirror. He was in no hurry to show aggression towards Emily. On the contrary, there was restraint in his behavior, as if he knew that cruelty was not necessarily measured by fists or weapons. His every step was measured and confident, as if this man had long ago come to terms with the weight of his role, but at the same time had not lost his inner strength and dignity. His face, covered with light stubble and marked by life, betrayed neither kindness nor ruthlessness. It was simply impenetrable. When their eyes met, an invisible spark of tension ran between them, a moment in which not just a prisoner and a warrior collided, but two worlds born of hatred and war. The internal conflict that was bubbling up in both of them was almost palpable in the air. This silent dialogue expressed fear, misunderstanding, and a strange attraction that seemed impossible in these circumstances. This moment forever changed the course of their destinies. A kind of bond was born between them, fragile and dangerous, but already inseparable. And although hatred was boiling on the surface, something else was emerging in the depths that promised to shake the foundations of both. He seemed like a stone among the winds, unshakable, heavy, silent. But Emily was beginning to notice something about him that went beyond the simple image of a warrior. He watched people not with the eyes of a predator, but as a man carrying a load of understanding. There was strength in him, but also fatigue. His every gesture was measured, but not heartless. He did not raise his hand unnecessarily, did not humiliate the prisoners. He only guided, watched, and seemed to be fighting something deeper than just a foreign people. His movements were sharp, but not violent. There was a restrained fury in his gaze, directed more inwards than outwards. He carried a burden that he was not obligated to share with others, but which became part of his walk, his silence. Sometimes, when he stood by the fire in the shade of the trees, Emily noticed how his face froze in an expression of longing, as if he was staring into something invisible that lived only in his memory. She didn't know who he was before this war, but every day I found myself thinking more and more often, he's not just an invader, not just the man who holds her fate in his hands. Behind a broad back, behind an imperious gaze, there was a man who was beaten, shaped, led, and betrayed. And this ignorance excited her more than fear. Emily was beginning to doubt what she had been taught. If the enemy is capable of silence, if the enemy knows how to look at you not as prey, but as a human being, is he still an enemy? She wasn't looking for answers. But inside her, the walls that had previously seemed indestructible began to shake. She was still afraid. I still hated it. Fear was deeply embedded in his body, living in the shivers that ran through his skin every time he came closer. Hatred throbbed in his chest, not because he had done something, but because that was what he had been taught, because it was the right thing to do. He was her enemy. He was the one who ruined her old life, who tore her out of the house, leaving ashes and crying behind. But it wasn't that simple. The longer she watched him, the more something strange grew in her, something that did not fit into understandable forms. Curiosity, respect, a faint, almost invisible feeling, like a shadow of respect, a hint that something else might be hiding under the rough skin of this world. He didn't look at her like the others. His gaze was direct, but not humiliating. His silence was complete, but there was no coldness in it. She felt two sides fighting inside her. One, the one that screamed to escape, reject, resist, and the other, the quiet one, almost whispering that not everything about this man was evil. It wasn't sympathy. It wasn't gratitude. It was a challenge. And it was she who was scaring the most. He didn't fit into the enemy's image. He broke ideas, violated boundaries. There was silence between them, as tight as a taut string. They hardly touched, almost did not cross words. But every glance, every random movement, every moment when their breaths matched, it was a challenge. An invisible bond slowly began to grow through the layers of resentment, pain, and distrust. Something that was not acknowledged out loud, but could no longer be denied. Neither of them knew yet how far this strange, poignant connection would take them. But fate, as if without asking, has already intertwined their steps, and there is no turning back. The first days in the camp flew by in a blur. Emily could barely make out the succession of sunrises and sunsets, as if her own time had frozen at a point where everything she knew had collapsed. She watched this world through a veil of fear and detachment, as if she was standing on the edge of a dream, not daring to enter it, but no longer having a way back. This was not her home, not her people, and yet this was where she breathed, lived, and existed. The surrounding nature was striking in its alien beauty. High cliffs like stone guards rose to the sky, and thickets of wormwood filled the air with bitterness. Sometimes in the morning the camp was enveloped in a cool haze, and in those moments there was silence, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Coyotes howled in the distance, their voice frightening but also strangely lonely. Everything breathed power, primordial and frightening, as if nature itself was watching every step of an outsider. The camp had a rhythm that Emily didn't belong to. Here, everything was woven into a cycle that was repeated day after day without requiring words. The men left at dawn to pick up their prey, their silhouettes disappearing against the grey sky, and upon their return they were greeted by glances in which there was no delight, only silent approval. The women worked by the fire, cooked food, dried hides, and raised children. The same children hopped between the tents like little shadows of freedom. Their laughter was ringing like bells and strangely cut to the heart. She didn't understand the words, the meanings, or the rituals, but her eyes remembered everything. How a young woman brushed her hair off her face before driving a knife into a fresh hide. How the old grandmother carefully rubbed the patterns on the pottery. As one of the men drew a beast on a piece of skin with charcoal, moving so intently as if it were a prayer. Emily sat by her tent, still separate, still lost, but not so broken anymore. In this world full of cruelty and order, a thin root began to sprout in her. Not love, not acceptance, but something like awakening. The female side of the camp greeted Emily with wariness, barely concealed by cold silence and glances full of silent disbelief. Here, among these women, every hard line and stern look told of years of struggle, loss, and pain that left no room for pity. They did not want to see in the captive something more than just an outsider, an enemy whom nature and fate had brought together with them on this earth. But camp life required participation, and Emily had no choice. She was forced to learn what was considered necessary, to help with cleaning, carry water, and participate in cooking. Every day was a test, On the one hand, the bitter realization that she was a stranger; on the other, the growing need to survive, obey, and understand these new orders. She learned to observe and adjust, trying to maintain her dignity in a world that seemed cruel and alien to her. The difference in cultures was enormous, as if two worlds had collided and were trying to coexist on the same piece of land. There was no place for pity or weakness. Every gesture had meaning, and every word had weight. Under these conditions, Emily began to realize that you can survive only by learning to be strong in a new way, not only physically, but also spiritually. She learned to read looks and gestures, to understand the language of silence and secret signals. And yet, amidst this distrust, one woman noticed that there was something about Emily that couldn't be broken, an unbroken force that couldn't be seen right away, but that could be felt. There was no resignation in her eyes, but something else, a subtle but persistent spark that neither time nor circumstances could extinguish. This quiet confession was Emily's first breath of hope in a world where there seemed to be no hope at all. The warrior she had liked in the first moment of fear was gradually changing in her eyes. His gaze, previously cold and impenetrable, became less distant. He was still strong and unyielding, but there was a hidden gentleness in that unshakable appearance that only those who could see the man behind the warrior's mask could see. He was one of the few who quietly protected Emily when others could afford to humiliate or reject her without visible consequences. In his presence, it seemed to her that she was not just a prisoner, but a person whose pain and fear had not gone unnoticed. It wasn't a loud defense, but a silent, almost invisible presence of power that couldn't help but be felt. Every day she began to see in him not a savage from scary stories, but a man with deep wounds that were not spoken out loud. His past was shrouded in shadow, but there was a quiet empathy in her heart that didn't require words. They exchanged glances, brief but meaningful, like a language without words, filled with understanding and careful trust. The moments around the campfire, when the night shadows slid across their faces, became something special for them. In these few-word meetings, in this look, which became softer and deeper, the foundation was laid on which something more than just survival could grow. It was the beginning of a bond that promised to change them both. In the camp, where strict order and unrelenting cruelty reigned, any signs of weakness became a reason for suspicion and conflict. One of the prisoners appeared who could not accept the new state of affairs. He loudly protested and tried to ignite the thirst for escape in the hearts of the others. His words attacked Emily, accusing her of betrayal and alleged collusion with enemies. His rage and intolerance created an atmosphere of danger around her, like a flame ready to ignite at any moment. Between two worlds that seemed distant and incongruous to her, Emily found herself trapped in the gazes and destinies. On the one hand, her own past filled with pain and fear; on the other, a new world that offered an unbearable price for survival. She felt this tension growing inside her, as if an endless storm was hanging over her, in which there was no light or peace. The tribal elder, whose authority was indisputable, openly opposed her. His words were cold and merciless. He demanded the expulsion of the stranger from the camp, seeing her as a threat to order and security. His voice cut through the silence, eliciting approval in the eyes of some tribesmen, but arousing doubts in the hearts of others. This was the first time that the internal cracks of the tribe became visible to everyone. However, the main warrior, who had previously hidden his feelings, decided to take a bold step. He stood up for Emily. His support was unexpected and powerful, like a bolt from the blue. He spoke not only with words, but also with a look full of determination and strength. This act created a wave of tension and suspicion among the rest of the warriors and elders, forcing them to reconsider their attitude towards the captive and the leader himself. At that moment, Emily realized that her fate was hanging on a thin, almost invisible line, between survival and exile, between hatred and protection, between fear and hope. This conflict was the first serious test, not only for her, but also for the one who for the first time dared to call her his protection. On one of the quiet but hectic days of the camp, as the sun was slowly sinking, Emily noticed a child who was scared and confused amid the fuss. Without hesitation, driven by a sincere desire to help, she carefully approached and gently took the baby in her arms, soothing him without words. Her actions were sincere and natural, and there was no desire to attract attention or earn praise. It was a pure outburst of her heart, an echo of that part of her soul that remained human and bright in the world of the harsh laws of the frontier. The main warrior who was watching from afar couldn't help but notice this moment. His gaze, usually cold and appraising, softened and filled with respect. In this small gesture, he saw not a prisoner, but a person, strong and kind, capable of caring even in the most difficult conditions. It was the beginning of a slow but important turning point in his attitude towards her. In the evening, when the camp was silent and only the crackling of the campfire disturbed the tranquility, Emily and the warrior happened to be alone. There was no longer the same tension of fear and dislike between them. She wasn't hiding behind a wall of distrust, and he wasn't trying to suppress or control her. Their silence was filled with a new understanding, where every look and gesture said more than words. They sat side by side under the light of the flickering fire, and in that quiet moment all that had been fear and enmity melted away, giving way to an invisible but tangible connection. The very silence hung in the air, in which something new was born, subtle, fragile and beautiful, barely discernible, but already inescapable. In the silence that came after long days of misunderstanding and tension, an elusive thread was emerging between two souls, so different and at the same time so close. Glances, casual and inconspicuous to others, crossed more and more often, like invisible beacons attracting each other in a sea of alienation. Those moments, short, almost fleeting, carried more than words could express. They were filled with emotions that they did not dare to accept or admit out loud. Emily felt the weight of contradictions in herself. Her heart, longing for freedom and peace, was suddenly captured by the man she was supposed to hate. An inner voice called out to duty, to loyalty to the family, to their own fears and memories of the pain inflicted by their enemies. But next to him, a melting feeling melted away, a growing affection, weak but persistent, like a spring drop breaking through the cracks of ice. At the same time, the warrior faced an equally painful choice. His duty to his tribe and people was as sacred and unquestionable as the cliffs on the horizon. But there was another truth hidden in the depths of his gaze, tenderness and respect, which he could not reject. This struggle between the power of tradition and the quiet voice of his heart tore him apart from the inside, forcing him to doubt and rethink everything that seemed unshakable. Every touch, every look became an act of resistance, an attempt to preserve the feeling, not to give out and not to destroy what was just beginning to blossom. In this silent dance between hate and love, they learned to see each other for real, despite the fear and pain. The days in the camp continued to flow, and in these seemingly simple moments, something more was born. Mutual respect based on quiet understanding and support. As Emily gradually got used to the new world, she began to notice that life among the Comanches was not only about struggle and fear, but also about traditions whose powers she had previously been unable to comprehend. The warriors, who were busy preparing for hunting or repairing guns, did not miss the opportunity to exchange experiences with the prisoner. She helped when she could, learn to recognize plants and understand the habits of animals. In response, the main warrior showed her the nuances of hunting and crafts, shared the secrets of survival in this harsh land. In these exchanges of knowledge, invisible walls of misunderstanding collapsed, and every moment of joint work became a step towards each other. The people around her stopped seeing her as a stranger, a prisoner, and began to perceive her as a person with her own fears, hopes, and strength. A sense of unity appeared in Emily's eyes more and more, despite the differences in culture and the past, which once seemed insurmountable. Gradually, the barriers erected by years of hostility and prejudice gave way under the weight of sincerity and care. Even those who initially refused to accept it began to look at it differently. with respect, or at least with understanding. It was a slow but sure process, where every little gesture and every word played a huge role. In this new reality, Emily felt for the first time in a long time that she wasn't just accepted, she was being seen. Not as a prisoner or an enemy, but as a person who has found her way among strange lands and strange hearts. Through the daily chores of the camp, in quiet, barely perceptible moments, a new thread emerged between them, a tenderness that was difficult to define and even harder to admit. These were not big words or obvious signs of attention, rather the smallest gestures that seemed random but carried the depth of feelings. A glance that lingered a little longer than necessary, or a light touch of a hand when there was a fuss and anxiety around. Emily felt something contradictory growing inside her, a mixture of hope and fear that gripped her heart. Every time they were near, she caught herself thinking that she wanted to be closer, but her mind told her to be careful. She was afraid of betrayal, afraid that these feelings would be revealed, that their love could cause new suffering, both for herself and for the one who had become so dear to her. This fear was both her protection and her prison. She learned to hide her feelings, to hide sincere glances behind a mask of indifference and alienation, trying not to give up in the eyes of those who watched her every move. But inside, a voice that wanted to be heard sounded louder and louder, the voice of a heart that could not be silenced. Despite the fears, moments of silent presence nearby in moments of danger or sadness became more frequent and significant. Those silent, supportive glances and presence, like invisible protection, said more than the thousands of words they were afraid to utter. In this fragile tenderness, amidst fear and doubt, a story was born that could change everything, but which still had to go through a storm of trials and prohibitions. The darkness of distrust and hostility gradually thickened around the nascent feelings of Emily and the main warrior. The tribe, accustomed to seeing only the enemy in the captive, could not accept this quiet, almost imperceptible bond, which slowly destroyed the rigid boundaries between friends and strangers. Glances filled with suspicion, whispers around campfires, and cold words became invisible arrows aimed at their relationship. The other prisoners, who themselves carried the burden of grief and resentment, could not understand what Emily and the warrior were trying to hide. Their open rejection and tough stance created an atmosphere of constant pressure, forcing the characters to stay on guard, hide their feelings and mask their true emotions behind a stone facade of indifference. Every touch, every look had to be carefully hidden, like a fragile secret that could destroy not only their bond, but also their very lives. This pressure aggravated the internal struggle of both. The fear of rejection, the fear of punishment and betrayal weighed on Emily's heart, making her doubt the correctness of her choice. The warrior, for his part, felt the burden of responsibility to the tribe and a duty that did not allow him to openly show his feelings. Their love became a secret that they cherished as their most precious treasure, despite threats and challenges. The growing tension wrapped their world tightly, like an approaching storm that threatened to destroy everything they had built on the shaky ground of mutual understanding and trust. Each new day brought challenges that required the heroes to be strong and determined to fight not only external enemies, but also their own fears and doubts. On one of those quiet evenings when the camp was bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, Emily felt something that could not be ignored. New feelings began to play inside her, tenderness and pain, intertwined together like two sides of the same coin. Everything she knew about hate, betrayal, and fear suddenly turned unstable and shaky before this discovery. She fell in love with someone she should have hated with all her heart. This realization did not come out of the blue, but gradually, through long hours of silence, joint observations of nature, through the terse but deep mutual understanding that grew between them. She understood that their feelings were a challenge to fate and society, to the insurmountable walls built by centuries of hostility. Love seemed to be a forbidden fruit, sweet and bitter at the same time. Her heart was filled with hope, but with it came fear. The fear of loss, a passion that could lead to the death of both herself and the one who had become everything to her. It was a contradiction that tore apart and haunted me. Determination flashed in Emily's eyes like a quiet fire, ready to fight against any obstacles, but deep down there was vulnerability and fear. She knew that there would be difficulties ahead. The tribe, the family, old wounds and unforgiven grudges. But at that moment, none of that seemed important. One thing was important. It was a feeling that gave her the strength to live and fight, no matter what. In the silence of the night, when the camp had fallen into a deep sleep and only the distant sounds of nature disturbed the peace, Emily was left alone with her thoughts. A storm was raging in her heart, something new and unusual, but so strong that it seemed capable of destroying all the walls built over the years. Confusion and fear intertwined with determination and hope, creating a complex tangle of feelings inside her that would not allow her to fall asleep. She thought about how far fate had brought her, from a quiet, dusty town to the heart of the people she should have feared and hated. Now she realized that the boundaries between the enemies were not as obvious as they had seemed before. The belief grew inside her that even in a world of cruelty and betrayal, something pure and real could be born. Doubts tried to extinguish this fire, but each time hope flared up with renewed vigor, reminding us that love is not a weakness, but a force capable of changing destinies. Her soul was searching for answers and ways to preserve this bright feeling in the dark shadows of war and hatred. She knew that there would be a struggle ahead, with herself, with the tribe, with the past. But that night was the point of no return. A new Emily was born in her, a woman who is not afraid to feel and fight, no matter what. And even if her path was difficult and full of dangers, she kept in her heart the spark that could light up even the darkest path. The days became more and more tense, as if the very air was saturated with anxiety and a premonition of the coming storm. On the border, where once there was relative silence, now the sounds of gunfire and screams could be heard, which echoed off the rocks and prairies. Comanches increasingly attacked squads of settlers, leaving behind smoking ruins of farms and destroyed cattle pens. Each skirmish burned both sides like an invisible fire that was burning stronger every day. The settlers, accustomed to hardship and constant danger, now lived in constant fear for their loved ones and their homes. Men were preparing guns and strengthening fences. Women were hiding children and praying for peace, even though they knew that war was coming. There was a tense silence on the streets of the town. Everyone understood that the conflict, which seemed distant and abstract, had become a reality that was coming on their heels. Emily, watching the changes around her, felt her inner anxiety grow every day. Memories of the quiet days in the Comanche camp now seemed like a distant fairy tale, immersed in the flames of real battles. She saw the destruction and violence tearing the world apart, but at the same time, her heart still held the tenderness that had appeared between her and the warrior, that secret, fragile spark that could give hope in the midst of chaos. The fear and hatred became more acute, and with each new skirmish, it seemed that everything was moving towards an inevitable war, to the moment when it would be impossible to turn back. In the heart of the raging war, each of them found themselves on different sides of an irreconcilable conflict. The warrior, whom Emily had once recognized from a different perspective, not only as a prisoner, but also as a man with deep feelings, was now in complete unity with his people. His soul was torn between the duty of a warrior and the tenderness that flared up inside for someone who had once been a stranger, but now became an important part of his life. He was relentless and merciless in battle, but there was an inner discord in the depths of his eyes that no one around him could understand. Emily, in turn, remained on the side of the settlers, those who had once been her family and home. She no longer wanted to be a prisoner, and the desire for freedom, perseverance, and strength born out of trials and pain awakened in her. But even among the enemies, behind dusty barricades and dense lines of fire, her heart still clung to the image of the warrior, the one she loved against all odds. The war was rapidly destroying their personal worlds, blurring the lines between friends and enemies, between love and hate. They had to make harsh decisions, sacrifice the past, and fight for a future that seemed so vague and uncertain. Every moment of separation seemed like an eternity, and every clash on the battlefield was a blow that broke not only the body, but also the soul. In this split between war and feelings, their real battle was born, not for lands and not for tribes, but for the right to be together, no matter what. A deep storm was raging inside the warrior. The voice of duty was thundering in his heart, but his feelings for Emily caused confusion and doubt. He was raised in the traditions of his people, where loyalty to the tribe and protection of its lands stood above all else. But now his soul was fighting with itself, torn between duty and tenderness, which penetrated into the most hidden corners of his heart. Outbursts of anger came when he thought that his feelings could betray his people. Despair gripped him in the silence of the camp, where thoughts were his only companions. In those rare moments of peace, he allowed himself to remember the past, childhood, the loss of loved ones, the trials that hardened his character. These memories only intensified his inner struggle, reminding him that responsibility and love often go down different paths. He saw how the destructive forces of war were destroying lives, and he understood that the choice he had to make would change not only his fate, but the fate of everyone around him. And he was not alone in this struggle. His soul longed for peace and quiet, and his heart for love, which could become a light in the darkness of a cruel world. The news that the settlers were going to free Emily by force spread quickly and reached the Comanche camp. Amidst the flames of the bonfires and the smell of gunpowder, the warrior felt his heart constrict in his chest. The realization that the coming assault could destroy everything that connected him with her. For him, it was not just another fight, but the risk of losing that one connection with the person who had awakened long-forgotten feelings in him. The settlers, driven by desperation and determination to regain their own, prepared for the offensive. Heavy footsteps, muffled voices, and the hum of fighting spirit filled the air at dawn. Each of them knew that this operation would be risky, and the cost of a mistake could be too high. But the thought of saving Emily gave them the strength to move forward despite their fear. When the battle began, the ground shook with the sounds of gunfire and screams. A whirlwind of chaos seized the camp, and in the midst of the battle, the heroine found herself on the verge of life and death. Soldiers from both sides fought not only for honor and land, but also for love, hope, and the future. The warrior, seeing the threat that loomed over her, was torn apart by an internal gap between duty and the desire to protect Emily at all costs. At that moment, it seemed as if fate was hanging on a thin thread, and the outcome of the battle would determine not only the course of the war, but also their common fate. The crucial moment came when everything that seemed unshakable began to crumble under the weight of choice. The warrior stood at the crossroads of fate. On the one hand, duty to the tribe; on the other, feelings that he could not ignore. An inner voice struggled with traditions. The memory of his ancestors collided with the desire to preserve what was dear to his heart. The warrior's gaze was firm, but there was pain in his eyes. The realization that this choice would change not only his life, but also the fate of those he loves. Emily, like a living flame of hope, remained in his heart, a light in the dark darkness of war and hatred. Her fear and expectation merged in a single breath as the time for a decision approached. His heart told him to go towards love, but duty stood like an insurmountable barrier. At that moment, he realized that real strength lies in the ability to choose what makes us human, not just warriors. When the decision was made, it became a turning point, changing the course of history and fate, forever linking their lives into one whole, despite all the obstacles. The story of Emily and the Comanche warrior is a journey full of trials, pain, and hope. They went through the darkness of war and internal conflicts, met hatred and love in the most unexpected places. Their souls have changed, intertwining with bonds that are beyond the control of time and circumstances. In this intersection of destinies, a new force was born, the power of forgiveness, understanding, and perhaps a new life. But what awaits them next remains a mystery, hidden behind the veil of the horizon. The world they live in is changing, and only time will tell how their fate will turn out. This uncertainty opens the door to a future where everything is still possible. Now we are saying goodbye to the heroes, but there is an echo of hope and anxiety in their stories, reminding us that even in the darkest moments there is a place for light and change. Their journey is not over. It continues where our story ends. Thank you for being with us and sharing this journey. If you like this story, please like it. Write your thoughts in the comments and be sure to subscribe to the channel. There are many more exciting stories ahead. See you soon.